And a very warm welcome. You're joining us here at Hyde Park on Derana 24. And tonight we will be discussing Sri Lanka's economic recovery path to prosperity, stability and a stable reform process that navigates the country out of the current trajectory. Of course, the key point of focus here is Budget 2026, where we're headed from a short-term focus to the long-term strategy that the Sri Lankan economy requires. I've invited to discuss all this to our studios here at Hyde Park. I have here with me Talal Rafi, economist and expert member of the World Economic Forum. A very warm welcome to you. We also have with us tonight at Hyde Park Dinouk Colombage, Chief Research Officer of the Geopolitical Cartographer and former Director General for the Office of the former President Ranil Wickremesinghe. Very warm welcome to you too. Of course, tonight, as promised, we'll discuss Budget 2026. I'd like to start off, simple question. Where are we headed? What kind of direction does Budget 2026 set for Sri Lanka, not just in the short term, but in the long term?
Thank you, Indeewari, for having me once again. So starting off, as far as the Budget 26 goes, I'll just touch on the macro side. So if you ask me in a sentence where the budget is, it's more focused towards macroeconomic stability and meeting most of the IMF targets. So that is where it is this thing. But I still say that, you know, some of the structural reforms, things related to infrastructure development and increased productivity are needed for economic growth. That is when the real growth would come. But as far as the current budget goes, I think it is understandable because even with the IMF program, there is a bit of little space. And it's good that there is fiscal discipline, because if you look at some of the stats, Sri Lanka is still not out of the woods. If you look at, according to the Finance Ministry, the gross financing needs for 2026 is 6.8 trillion rupees. So that is the total amount of financing that's needed for 2026 by the government alone. So that is the fiscal deficit, the entire debt that's maturing that has to be repaid, and also the interest rates for 2026. So the total financing is 6.8 trillion. That's about 20% of the entire Sri Lankan economy. So if you look at how much the government needs to finance next year, 6.8 trillion comes up to around 13 million rupees every minute. So that's by the time we finish this, we may hit a much larger amount. So considering that, but a lot would come down. I mean, next year, the superannuation fund, the interest rates are set to come down, and the rates for the central bank, where the government borrowed, those are set to come down. So it is set to come down, and the president spoke about bringing the gross financing needs to 13.5%. which is where we have to have it. Right now, it's close to 20%. So considering all that, I think it's good that the fiscal discipline is there. But still, we are running a fiscal deficit. And if you want to link that to our debt sustainability after 2028, I can speak about it later.
Sure, sure. We'll talk about it. But Dinouk, are we focusing reform, restructure, growth, or are we still figuring out a way out of the crisis? The president himself said that he has much to fix in the economy because he inherited a country that has suffered grave crisis.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, this budget is really just a continuation of that IMF program that was started by former President Ranil Wickremesinghe in 2022. There's really nothing more to this budget in that sense. And that, you know, I think is very much a recognition that the program that was started back in 2022 is one that is widely accepted as the only way for Sri Lanka to recover from the economic crisis. However, unfortunately, you asked about reforms. We're not seeing any reforms. The reform program, again, that was started by the former president, which would have seen as many as 75 state-owned enterprises in the country either restructured, privatized, or in some cases shut down, has been completely shelved. we'll take, for example, I'll just name three. CEB, which was unbundled during our time, the idea behind it was to unbundle CEB into several smaller companies that would allow for private investment into the energy sector. Unfortunately, now the government has announced that while the unbundling is happening, it's still going to remain 100% state-owned. So really nothing has changed there. CPC, the fuel distribution of the country, was liberalized, again with private sector players coming into the market to increase competitiveness and thereby reduce the cost of the fuel. Unfortunately, again, in this year, we've seen one of the proposed players who had agreed to come in, United Petroleum, withdraw because of a lack of confidence in the government. And then, of course, the big one, Sri Lankan Airlines. Last year, over 7 billion rupees in profit. This year, a loss of 2 billion rupees. On top of that, a 20 billion rupee infusement by the government to keep the airline afloat. Now, Sri Lankan Airlines is a problem that this government has inherited. However, the government and members of the NPP need to raise their hand and take responsibility for the continued stuttering of the reforms to Sri Lankan Airlines. Since 2015, when the UNP has been in power, successive attempts have been made to privatize the airline. Unfortunately, every time that has happened, members of the now ruling party used to take to the streets with their unions and opposed it. I saw on Friday now the president said that it is a massive problem, nobody wants to touch it, and they're going to look at alternatives. I'm curious to know what these alternatives are. But honestly, with this budget, we're not seeing any reforms going forward. And that is a concern for us because come 2026, December, the IMF program ends. So where do we go from there? So certainly this budget will help us limp along through the next year, but it's going beyond that. There's very little reason to be hopeful. And we also have to remember that, yes, the president inherited an economy that had been ravaged by bankruptcy. Unfortunately, they have not given credit to the former president that he handed over an economy that had been stabilized. And the stage was set to continue the IMF program and go further with the reform program, where then by 2028, when we will start to repay the debt, we'd be in a strong position to do so while continuing economic growth.
I think the opposition claims that this budget is strongly aligned with the International Monetary Fund program or is aligned and is catering to the requirements of the IMF. I'd first like to ask Dinouk, shouldn't the government go on the path of the IMF program? And why is it bad to align the budget in line with IMF requirements?
Well, we have to remember that unfortunately, the opposition that's in right now, they themselves were uncertain when it came to the IMF program. In April 2023, the IMF agreement was tabled in Parliament for debate and vote. And on that occasion, the SJB got up and walked out, while ironically, the NPP voted against that very agreement that they are now implementing. So I'm not going to take what the opposition, I can't speak on behalf of the opposition, I can speak on behalf of the UNP. And we have always said that the IMF program must continue. Our election platform at the presidential election was the continuation of the IMF program. So as far as that's concerned, yes, the government is doing so. They have taken our advice. Unfortunately, they are not going far enough. The IMF program alone will not ensure long-term sustainability and growth for the country. It will ensure that, as Talal said, fiscal discipline will be introduced. But we need to look beyond that. And we're not seeing that with this budget.
Talal, to continue on Dinouk's comments, I think he spoke about investments, SOE reforms, but let's put that aside for a little while to focus on the IMF. The IMF program itself, well, Sri Lanka has to follow it. Come 2028, as you mentioned, what are we going to do? So Dinouk said we haven't gone as far as we should. So how far should Sri Lanka go in order to ensure that we just not implement the IMF program, but look at sustainability beyond the EFF?
Continuing on that, just a brief thing, I've mentioned this before as well. You see, the IMF program is a stabilization program. So IMF is not a development bank. So For example, as I said in the previous show, it's like an ICU. So when the patient goes, it's whether the patient is going to be alive or not. So in an extreme place of instability, the patient's health. So the IMF, like the ICU, stabilizes him and gets him out of the ICU where he is able to survive. Then either he can go home or he can go to another doctor who will take the process from there.
Or we can take some vitamins.
Yes,
Crucial.
true.
So what vitamins are necessary here for the economy?
Here, the IMF stability that has been achieved. And we have had stability for long. During Mahinda Rajapaksa's time, from 2005 to 2015, we had macroeconomic stability. During President Kumaratunga's time, except for 2001, we had macroeconomic stability. You see, stability is not something that's going to get us growth. Stability is needed for growth, but it's not something, it is something like doing O-levels, but to go to do well in A-levels just because you passed O-levels doesn't guarantee that. So on that path, we need to work on some of the structural reforms. Of course, on the fiscal front, there is very limited space because there's a 13% limit on the primary expenditure. And as I mentioned, 6.8 trillion rupee of gross financing needs. That is something that has to be taken. Otherwise, that's a monster that's building up that will eventually eat the whole nation. But as far as structural reforms go, I think you don't need that much fiscal space to do these. Like, for example, there was a study saying that, about 30% of costs for SMEs is due to administration costs. So those can be done. Ease of doing business, these are certain things, if you need the political will, that can be done. And even if you look at this, there are two ways you can structure this. With the primary expenditure at 13%, and if you're taking about 4% for capital expenditure, there's only one space you can really cut in on. That is the state sector, where you have to maybe reduce the workforce. For that, political will is needed. That can free up a bit of fiscal space where you can use it for other means. So these are some of the areas that we can work on. SOE reforms is a must because that's causing a lot of losses on the balance sheet. The second thing is trade liberalization. We need to move and become a nation that exports, because currently there is always an anti-export bias. If we are focusing on import substitution, but by putting barriers, it's not going to help us very much on the exports. Because if you look at now, the way global trade happens has changed. About 70% of global trade is supplying value chains. So it's the intermediate level trade that is taking place. If you look at Thailand and all, about 50% of Thailand's exports are intermediate. Sri Lanka, it's less than 10%. But importing 50% of our, around 40 to 50 is intermediate. So we import from supply, parts for our final product, but we are never part of the global supply chains. That is because trade liberalization, trade facilitation, we are, according to a report, we are even worse than sub-Saharan African countries. We tell the WTO that even some stuff which countries like Congo and Angola can do, we are unable to do. It's a bit embarrassing. We say that we don't have the expertise, we are unable to do. So these are some of the structural reforms. You don't need the IMF for this. You
mean produce, manufacture in the country?
Yes, for those. What I'm talking about is liberalization, like with customs, SOEs. So these, you don't need the fiscal space for that. This only needs political will. You don't need the IMF for that. The IMF, they have their rules, they are okay with it. The IMF program itself says eliminate para-tariffs, liberalize trade. You need the FTAs. Just implement the FTAs with Singapore and Thailand.
So are you saying we haven't done enough to match the IMF program itself?
Yes. What I'm saying is we can go beyond the IMF program. The IMF has kept let's say 7 requirements, but 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, those are maybe not part of the IMF program, but even if we do it, it's not going against the IMF program. We can easily, some of these structural reforms, land, labor, so those are, if you look at study China, China was a big miracle. So between 1980, from the time it opened to 2010, it grew at around at double digits. And there major things happened. About 50% of the growth of China came through increasing productivity. So it was land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. So there you find a couple of interesting facts also. People from the rural sector moved to the urban sector. So they moved into factories. The way the Chinese economic function changed. But also if you find that in 1978, about 52% of China's employment was given by the state sector. But if you look at it at 2010, it was reduced to 13%. So what the Chinese government did was a large number of people working for the state were let go. They were either trained or they were absorbed into the private sector.
Right.
You see, those sort of transformations help because currently, according to a study, about 95% of the state sector workers are not up to skilled. So if it can be reduced, of course, cannot be done overnight, and people, any government doesn't have the political will to do that. So we spend about 2 trillion on that. So that's about 6% of GDP. So that is some sort of a space which can be reduced to provide maybe incentives on the tax for productive sectors here.
Right.
So those are some of the things that we can do, because one thing is there is limited space from fiscal side to growth. One is you can of course give the tax concessions, other things, or for that you have to reduce expenditure. And where do you reduce expenditure? Of course, we can't cut down on the capital expenditure like infrastructure, road, other there. So that's good that they have 4% on that. The only other thing is, of course, interest rates we can't. We have to pay. The public sector, that is a thing. And of course, public sector, another thing in the way I have always said this, we need to, of course, downsizing is one thing. I think even the president's economic advisor mentioned that there is a need to do this. But at the same time, for the senior staff, salaries have to be increased. Then only they will stay. Otherwise, they can move abroad or they can move to the private sector. So we need the best minds in the state sector. So senior level people, director, ministry secretaries, they need to be paid much more. Like the central bank is paid higher than other this thing, and rightly so. So like that, many institutions, the senior staff have to, because we need the talent in the public sector as well.
So to continue on that, I think a major messaging during the time of the then government, when the IMF program was implemented, was also that the state should not be in the business of running businesses. So what urgent reforms do you think we have missed out through this budget? Also, not to make it a balancing act for just the fiscal year 2026, but to ensure sustainability of the state sector.
Well, I think first and foremost, the urgent one was, of course, Sri Lankan Airlines. I mean, that is a burden on every citizen of this country, and it's not bringing benefits to the country. Now, we went through a process of open tenders, which unfortunately were not met with adequate interest from the public. So instead, we were then ready to pursue a single source expression of interest, and through negotiation try and alleviate the government's budget books from holding that. So Sri Lankan Airlines is one, but I mean, that's just a single company. But if we look at it on a larger scale, we have to take our energy sector. And that is one that requires urgent reform, which again will ensure that not only is the government no longer footing a hefty bill to subsidize this, which is unfortunately what is happening once again, but it will also open the door for private investment into that sector and a diversification. One of the big areas that was focused on during the 22 to 24 period was the expansion of renewable energy and the investment in renewable energy. And between the Adani project in the west with Mana and along with then several dozen smaller projects, there was in excess of $3 billion worth of renewable energy projects that are on the books. I mean, that is not just much needed foreign earnings for the country, but it is also providing us providing us the roadmap to move in towards a new export industry as well. Sri Lanka's requirement for the energy sector is only a small percentage of our total possibility out there. We have something like between 70 and 80 gigawatts of renewable energy assets around the country. Now, had we gone ahead with the reforms in that energy sector, it would have opened up the opportunity for us to utilize the excess energy and sell it to places like India and South India, who are going to be desperately needing this excess energy as their economies drive forward. So not only are we reducing the burden on the taxpayers by privatizing and liberalizing these SOEs, but we're also opening up new avenues for export. Unfortunately, those are not going ahead right now. I think the entire reform program has been shelved. And I think that's, a massive failing on the part of this government in this budget.
Going forward, I think we also spoke about trade pacts and trade liberalization. We understand that Sri Lanka were in discussion with countries to strike agreements in terms of whether it's free trade agreements or expanding what we already have. And RCEP is something that we have been talking about. So do you think our industries are now geared to support that kind of expansion?
Well, I think before we even look at whether the industries are geared, I think we have to come back to the question, is the political will to carry through with the agreements that have already been signed? In 2017, 2018, the Singapore Free Trade Agreement was signed, but since then it has not been fully initiated. In 2023, the Free Trade Agreement with Thailand was signed. That is still to kick off. The ECTA with India is still dragging on. And we were at the final stages. Unfortunately, with the new government, the Indian side is now requesting the government to appoint a chief negotiator. So whether the private sector is geared to meet the demands of these FTAs, I think is another topic that definitely needs to be looked at. But those private sector industries are not going to gear themselves up because they're not seeing the follow-through on the part of the government to implement these free trade agreements. It is only natural that the private sector, when offered access to newer markets, they will naturally develop and evolve to feed into those markets. So I think we have to really recognize, and I'm coming from a centrist right point of view, private sector is the engine behind economic growth. We have to give them the space to do so. The government does not need to worry about whether or not the private sector is geared up to it. Private sector will take care of themselves. The government just has to make sure the space is there for them to expand. And we're not seeing that happen right now with the complete stagnation of these free trade agreements.
I'd like to turn to discuss about tax reform and the business environment. I think at the beginning of the conversation we spoke about the conducive environment that we've been wanting for investment. Is that something that the budget supports, the 2026 budget through tax reform? Are we focusing enough, or what are the concerns?
So as I mentioned, with the IMF program going on, there is not much space to give as much tax concessions as possible. So on that front, things are at a standstill. As I mentioned, since we have a limit on the
But do we need tax concessions?
I mean, there are, as I mentioned in my previous reply, you don't really need tax concessions alone to spur business. Some of the reforms itself could take care of it. Land, labor, getting investments in. Like, for example, let me give a thing about our repayments starting in 2028. Currently, we are financing around $1 billion. This is excluding the multilaterals. So after 28, it's going to, like the president said, it's only a less than $1 billion, around $1 billion increase from now to 28. So it's not that steep. But what the government also needs to realize is the IMF has projected some figures for us for the gross reserves. So, from January 27 to December 27, our reserves have to go from 9 billion to 13 billion. So a $4 billion rise. And even on the year 28, even though the increase from currently to there, it's only going to be a $1 billion increase. At the same time, in 28 itself, our reserves have to increase from 13 billion to 15 billion. I mean, it's projected, it has to. So there is going to be a bit of a $3 billion rise. So these are things that have to be taken into account. And also, another factor also, I'll just mention this about the reserves. Reserves, since last year have been lagging at $6.1 billion. But that $6.1 billion itself is also, you can't really call it, because the Chinese swap is also part of it, about 1.3 billion. So that, two things. One is you can only use it as long as you have 3 months worth of imports. The other thing is it's in yuan. So most of the loans are dollar repayments. Even Chinese loans sometimes are denominated in dollars. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, the more important thing to note is the net reserves. So the net reserves is only at around 1.9 billion, because out of the 4.7 billion, if you take away the Chinese swap, about 2.8 billion is the central bank has liabilities. So its actual reserves, the net reserve is only around 1.9 billion.
This is also a concern for Sri Lanka if we do not improve on our reserves position going forward. So what measures should have been taken to spur that kind of, whether it's growth or even improve Sri Lanka's reserves position through foreign exchange earnings in the longer term?
So, so one thing is, I'm saying having net reserves at 1.9 billion or the current gross reserves at 6.1 billion, I mean, it's not a thing to be like really alarmed about, because at the way things are going, it's fine. You know, you're going to be rising, paying, barely manage with the current account. I mean, of course, we have to increase our exports and FDI gradually. But what I have been always saying is not that. It's about the external shocks. You know, anything could come. What the IMF in its projections doesn't count is if there could be a possible shock. Like, for example, Israel having an attack on Iran, oil prices going up, or Trump suddenly, you know, imposing higher tariffs on Sri Lanka, or the Federal Reserve increasing rates. So with that, just to describe Sri Lanka, I'll just not try to make it gloomy, but if you look at the IMF program, most of the targets, I mean, we are doing extremely well on the fiscal side. For a nation that came out of the crisis in 2022. So we are having a primary surplus. Primary is expenditure minus revenue minus interest payments. So, but if you compare it to, for example, Mexico went into a near default, almost like our 2022 in 94. So from 1983 to 1994, for 11 years, Mexico had a primary surplus. And in 91, 92, 93, Mexico had a budget surplus. I mean, that is not even, that is 10 times better performance than Sri Lanka on the IMF parameters or the macroeconomic indicators. So Mexico performed extremely well on the macro side, the fiscal side. It had a surplus. I mean, we can't even imagine a surplus. We are on a 5.2 deficit on the budget surplus. Mexico had a 3% surplus. We have a deficit of 5%. But still in 94, Mexico came close to collapse. That was because one factor, interest rates in the US went up. And there was a little bit of political instability in Mexico. So these two factors brought the, I mean, look at the Asian financial crisis. The macro targets, the IMF related stuff, the fiscal, all of them were good. I mean, Thailand and all had surpluses, primary surplus, but still within 6 months they were brought in. Because the problem is, like, we can get the fiscal right, but then fiscal balance and current account balance are different things. Of course, the fiscal side has an effect according to the twin deficit hypothesis. Like, if you have a large fiscal deficit, it will lead to a larger current account balance. But what we need to also focus is on those things. The Sri Lanka is could be very prone because of an external crisis. Let me give a few examples. Like, for example, India. India went close to collapse in 91. Of course, these countries have their own issues, a lot of things, mostly as we see in Sri Lanka, the same issues is bloated public service, subsidies, low government revenue, all these things added up. But what brought India to collapse? It was because Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. What brought Mexico's near collapse? Because the US government increased interest rates. And what brought the Argentine crisis in 2001? That was because one of the, these are the triggers, not the actual cause, was because Brazil was devaluing its currency. So the Russian crisis came in 98 because of the Asian financial crisis. So there is also a thing called contagion. So one act external which is completely beyond Sri Lanka's control can also have an impact on this front.
Certainly. We did have impact
Yes.
after the Easter attacks, COVID, the Sri Lankan economy suffered. I'd like to get Dinouk's opinion on the same point, external shocks. I believe the president himself mentioned that Sri Lanka has navigated successfully despite external shocks on the economy. What's your opinion there? And also, in terms of external shocks, the IMF itself said that the world has fared better than feared, especially in the face of Trump tariffs, as we call it, and other external shocks. So how do you think Sri Lanka is going to face any potential shocks in a future scenario?
Well, I think we have to recognize that what Trump did, he did to the entire world. So in that sense, everyone was back on even keel. Sri Lanka was not isolated in the tariff hike by America. And we have been able to a great extent, ride it through. I know that the apparel industry and all did take a hit, but apart from, a couple of hiccups along the way, they have been able to, for the greater part, go through it. I think it will really be next year that we'll be able to gauge better what the impact is, because I think everyone globally is also trying to understand what exactly are the tariffs that are facing each country. Everyone is still confused about that. However, we also have to look at how the rest of the world responded to the Trump tariffs. And one of the big things that we saw was they immediately sought out alternative markets. Europe is the EU is in discussion with India to access the market. The UK has accessed the Indian market with their free trade agreement. The ASEAN regions are really looking at their border tariffs. China is obviously looking at everyone. So, and then of course the African continent. There's a lot more investment, especially from countries like China, going into the African continent, which is giving them far greater leverage with America. That then resulted in last week or the week before, President Trump reducing the tariffs on China, and China in turn reducing theirs. But Sri Lanka, I don't think, can just be solely reliant on a single market or a single economy. And that is something that they have to take away from this year. So that means that for the government, first thing we have to do is we have to increase investor confidence. Now let's go back a couple of months to September this year. The US State Department released a report studying the climate environment, investor environment in Sri Lanka. And it was a fairly damning report in that they clearly said experienced investors were not going to come into the country unless there was structural reform. They went on to also call out the president's target or the government's target of $5 billion investment for this year, saying that right now investments are between $3 to $5 million, small, pocket change in that sense. So when the world's largest economy speaks, everyone listens. And that report has not been addressed by this government. We want investments to come in. We need investments to come in from different parts of the world. But in order to do so, we have to address the issues back at home. The shift in the economy needs to happen. As Talal spoke earlier, we are very much an import-focused economy. There needs to be that shift to a value addition export economy, and we need to enter into the global supply chain. That's not happening right now. The idea that the state-owned enterprises can run the show and that we can become self-sufficient is an unfortunate fairy tale that still people are clinging to. Prior to the crisis in 2022, Gotabaya Rajapaksa's government attempted that on many matters, and it fell flat on its face. I mean, for many of the younger people, let's remind them of 72. We closed the economy off and we decided to become self-sufficient. Yes, there were the odd cases of success, but the greater picture was it was a complete failure and the economy collapsed. So self-sufficiency, closed economies, those don't work. We can't look to guard against external shocks. Instead, we have to look to be a lot more flexible and be ready to alternate when necessary. So alternative markets, a diversification of our exports, and a greater emphasis on our exports are three of the big steps. And then, of course, in improving investment climate in the country.
Right. I think it's time we take a short break here at Hyde Park. We'll talk about whether investor confidence, real growth is a focus going forward, and how much space the budget allows for social spending, for people to really feel the benefits of economic growth and what we have as development in the economy. We'll be right back after this short break. To stay with us. Welcome back. We are in conversation with Talal Rafi and Dinouk Colombage on Sri Lanka's economic reform path, recovery and budget 2026, whether it lays out the structural program that Sri Lanka requires to move ahead. I'd like to focus on SMEs. Are we really looking at sufficient efforts or support to Sri Lanka's small, medium, micro enterprises as well? They took the biggest hit, whether it was COVID, as we mentioned before, Easter attacks, and even the prolonged shutdown. And what kind of emphasis would you have liked the government to have on the SMEs?
Yes, so SMEs are a very important topic, because at the end of the day, a very large portion of Sri Lanka's economy covered by the SMEs, and they employ a lot. Yeah. And when they benefit, it's more wealth distribution is much greater. So here again, as far as these things, as I mentioned, the fiscal space may be tight, but there are some of the, at least the reforms and other fronts that the government could do and should do. Like, as I mentioned before, a stat about 30% of costs of SMEs go to administration costs. That is one thing. Then ease of doing business. So these are things that even as a consultant for the ADB, I worked specifically on these things. So when we talk to SMEs, when we conduct the studies, so these are some of the complaints. Ease of doing is one thing is tough. They're not necessarily looking at tax concessions, though of course it will be helpful. But their main concerns is like ease of doing business. That is definitely one thing. Access to quality control, other things, especially when they're trying to export. So that is another thing. And also ability to get things done through the government. Like, for example, if you take sectors such as GEM and others, there's only one center. And sometimes you have to spend half a day. And there was another instance when I was speaking to a stakeholder who mentioned that every day to get an export or a thing done, you have to go to the same office. They ask you for the same copies, the business registration, all these, and then they want 2 photocopies of that. And the next day you have to do the same thing. So some of these things, reduce the stress on them. And even if you look at ease of doing business, we are 99th in the world when it comes to enforcing business contracts, which is quite important. So if you look at read the book Why Nations Fail, which won the Nobel Prize last year. So they say that the main reason why countries develop and reason why countries don't develop is institutions. So of course, if you look at the US and others, there is a lot of investor confidence. I mean, even right now, we say the dollar is it's the dominant currency in the world, about 60%. Even if Trump, it's disproportionate. Like, look at the largest economy in the world is the US at around $30 trillion. 60% of central bank reserves around the world is US dollars. The second largest is China. It's only 2/3 the size, but reserves, so only 2% of reserves around the world are the yuan. One thing is, of course, the Chinese also don't want to push their currency. But the main thing is also trust in the institutions, the independence of the central bank in the US, their judicial processes, all these help businesses. So these are certain things that, apart from the fiscal side, because one thing is, like, if we always ask any government, what are the concessions? The immediate reply would be like, there is no fiscal space. But some of these reforms, like administration-related regulatory reforms, ease of doing business, judicial reforms, land reforms, 80% of land in Sri Lanka is owned by the government, labor reforms. So these are things that can be done with a stroke of a pen, like if you have the real political will. So these are things that I feel would help. And also another point is there was a study done by the London School of Economics. I mean, there's always arguments for tax cuts. Of course, it will help. I'm not against giving tax concessions. But it was done on around 40 countries, looking at about 4 decades of data, which showed that, giving tax concessions has little to no effect on economic growth. So it mostly benefits the people at the top. So if you look at other countries, there is government revenue very high, like countries such as France, Germany, others. Government revenue is high, but at the same time, government expenditure is also high. And it's also, economics is always about allocating. If you look at China, why it transformed, it was because the resources are allocated elsewhere. Like you're giving a tax concession, but the question is, are you giving it to the correct industry? Which can benefit? I mean, a large conglomerate like John Keel's giving it there, or you want to give it to a company in a sector which is going to fail and the company is not administrated well. In that sector, you give it. Like, where do you allocate these resources? So the fundamental thing is that it cannot be done because, obviously, even the top minds in the private sectors and investment banks, they can't get it right. So it's very difficult to give that task to a government official to decide which sectors go. The Soviet Union tried it and it failed. So like Dinouk mentioned, it's always about the way you organize the economy. Like one factor which worked well for most Sri Lankans don't realize this is because in 1948, we were the second best economy in Asia. So we were called the Switzerland of Asia. So this lasted from 1948 to 1956. And the finance minister at that time was Mr. J.R. Jayawardena. So things took a turn in 1956. That was when we went into a more socialist model. Import substitution came in, large amount of subsidies. The state sectors, the state started taking over industries, transport, plantation, most of these. In 70s, we did another big round of that. So from 56, the economy has taken another turn from which we never really recovered. And talking about 77, the same finance minister who was successful in between 48 to 56 came back to power. But the reforms done were not fully done. I mean, these are things put out by Professor Premachandra Athukorala. Even he says that half-hearted, meaning like even the economy was liberalized, but there are still 500 state-owned enterprises. So those fronts, those can be, I would say, the reforms, the structural reforms, like the independence of the central bank, which keeps inflation under control, those things are a bit equally important as compared to tax concessions or other freebies.
Right. Is there sufficient space for social spending? And do you think the real benefits of any stability that the economy achieves is being passed down to the people? The people suffered the most during the crisis, post-crisis, during the chaos that Sri Lanka faced. So is there sufficient focus on passing the benefits down to the people?
I think every government, I mean, we have to be fair by every government, they do look to, pass on benefits to the public, if for nothing else, but it is vote-winning tactics. Unfortunately, the way that these are being passed on to the public are very often fairly short-lived measures. For example, up until, really 2016-17, fuel was heavily subsidized in the country, which meant that, for that period of 10 years, 15 years, we had fuel at lower than global prices. And that saving was, of course, then passed on to the public in regards to lower prices. But then that all came to head in 2022 when then, once the collapse happened, fuel prices jumped as high as over 500 rupees to the litre. So what efforts are being made to pass on these savings and to reduce the burden on the public are probably not being directed in the right way. We are continuing to, or the state is continuing to use funds that could otherwise be brought about to reduce the burden on the public to prop up these state-owned enterprises. In doing so, their belief is that it's going to reduce the burden on the public. So yes and no, it's a yes and no answer really to that question, that yes, they are trying, but no, it is not going to be a it's not a long-term plan to reducing the burden on the public. And I think, again, we come back to the very simple fact that the biggest way that we can reduce the burden on the public is to reduce public expenditure. Right now, we have a situation where in 2023, over 50% of our tax revenue went to pay state sector salaries. Now, that means that all three of us here at this conversation, 50% of what we paid in taxes went to pay somebody else's salary, very often in an institution that is probably not, producing results that need to be produced. So let's look at reducing the size, as Talal drew attention to. Even the president's economic advisor earlier this year, he spoke about the need to reduce the state sector by over 50%. Now that requires political initiative, but it also requires public support. And I think the public also needs to recognize that for every government job given, that's a further strain on the rest of the public, because it is our tax money that's going in to pay these salaries. So even though we think that by giving public sector jobs and ensuring a pension, we're reducing the burden on the people, that's really, it's just pulling a veil over our eyes.
I'm told we don't have much time, so for your closing remarks, I'd like to focus on what sense do you make of the value-added tax threshold and how people really benefit out of this. Relief measures for the people. And you mentioned, Talal, that Sri Lanka was once known as the Switzerland of Asia. So how do we ensure that we don't become an Argentina of Asia or a Greece of Asia and look at, well, if Switzerland is too far to achieve at this point, at least if you look at what India did in 1991 to not go back to the IMF but stand on its own feet. So closing remarks to you, gentlemen.
Sure. Thank you. So I'll touch on the last thing. So about Sri Lanka was extremely doing well in 48. So a thing that I would always be cautious of is the fiscal side and the macroeconomic ones. So because sometimes if you look at the study of Argentina, in the 1990s it was doing well. I mean, it was at the advice of the IMF, it had brought things under control, and the IMF also, showcased it as a poster boy for success. And what they did was, just like Sri Lanka, the Argentine government also believed that what the IMF was saying meant that everything was fine, the flowery praises, and they became overconfident. And they stepped a little bit outside. The IMF pulled out, and in 21 they went into another default. So what I would say is that we need to stick to macroeconomic stability and all the fiscal side, and growth has to be ensured through structural reforms, not through much from the fiscal side, meaning like excessive borrowing to give concessions here and there. The other thing is, of course, once we have growth, we can bring in all these things. But that is one thing. India, in contrast, India, after 91, or most of these Southeast Asian countries after the Asian financial crisis, never went back to the IMF. That is because they implemented the IMF program. Even in 91, we all talk about Manmohan Singh and others, but what they implemented was World Bank IMF program measures, which transformed those countries to not go back to the old version of that. But at the same time, we have to take care of the external sector as well. That is extremely important. FDIs exports, and reduction of borrowing costs. Because Sri Lanka has one of the highest borrowing costs in the world. About half of our expenditure goes to paying interest rates. And as I mentioned, I would state again, Mexico had a fiscal surplus. Sri Lanka is not even close to it in 91, 92, 93, but still came close to collapse in 94. So sometimes we should look at the devil is always in the details. So just because the IMF says everything is fine, look, the IMF's mandate is stability. So when the IMF says everything is okay, they are looking at it from the stability point of view.
But it's for the country to look at structural reforms and implement them.
And also the other thing is the central bank. The central bank's mandate is price stability, keeping inflation one. Their second objective is financial sector stability. So when the central bank says they are right, they are mostly focusing on their mandate. So I think Sri Lanka, I would always say we have to be cautious. Just because we get the fiscal discipline right, that doesn't guarantee that debt would be unsustainable.
Right,
sustainable, sorry.
So I'll take the first bit that you spoke about VAT. Now the president spoke about reducing the ratio between indirect and direct taxation. And then he follows that up by reducing the threshold for VAT from 60 million to 36 million per annum. That's definitely going to have a knock-on effect to the public, and we're going to see a rising cost of living. Now, it should be mentioned that right now the government is going to face a significant shortfall in their tax revenue next year, because this year we saw an unprecedented tax income from vehicle exports. Over 580 million rupees was earned in tax revenue from vehicle imports this year. Let's go back to 2019, before COVID, 130 million was earned in tax revenue for vehicle imports. The government in many ways is, I think, fooling themselves by believing that this revenue, this huge amount that they have earned from vehicle imports, is a sustainable target. It's not. It is a result of 3+ years of pent-up demand that has just exploded in one go, and now it's over. Even today in the morning in the papers, vehicle importers are saying the demand is leveling off, the prices are coming down. They're trying to prop up demand again, but they recognize that that is over. So definitely taxation, they have to find that greater balance between indirect and direct taxation. Reducing VAT continually is going to have an impact on the greater population. So let's pursue the digitization of the IRD and make sure that income tax is our main earner. Still, too many people in the country are avoiding taxation. The digitization is one step forward in addressing that. Secondly, in terms of why did India not have to go back to the IMF in 91? I think if we want to really break it down into simple terms, it's because India saw through the IMF program. Sri Lanka has entered into 17 programs, the greater majority of which have not been completed. Now, we cannot afford to not complete this program. But that also doesn't mean that once we complete this program, that in December 2026, everything is fine and we're done. It means that, as Talal rightly pointed out, this is just a stabilization program. Growth-oriented policies need to be brought in. Until that is done, I think India's example of not looking back in regards to economic growth is still probably just out of our reach.
I think on that note, it's time we wrap up at Hyde Park on Other Derana 24. We were in conversation with Talal Rafi, expert member of the World Economic Forum and economist who has now continued to be a regular contributor to Hyde Park. Thank you very much for your time here. We also had with us Dinouk Colombage, Chief Research Officer for the Geopolitical Cartographer and former Director General of the Office of the former President Ranil Wickremesinghe. Thank you very much for your time here as well. We'll see you again next week with yet another discussion. A Hyde Park special on Budget 2026 will follow this week as well. Have a pleasant evening. Good night.